My son's expression shifted the moment he saw her sitting at my kitchen table, and I won't pretend it didn't hit me somewhere deep. He'd walked in carrying a manila folder, like he owned the place, his wife 2 steps behind him, with that practiced smile she'd been wearing for months. Then he stopped. His eyes moved from me to the woman across the table, and whatever confidence he'd carried through my front door drained right out of him. "Dad," he said. His voice came out smaller than I'd heard in years. "What is she doing here?" Paulette didn't answer. She wrapped both hands around her mug of tea, looked at my son the way a retired school teacher looks at a student who hasn't done his reading, and said nothing. I took a slow sip of my own coffee. "Good to see you too, son." He didn't respond. His wife had gone very still beside him, and standing there in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, my son looked more uncertain than he had since he was 12 years old, and I'd caught him lying about where he'd been. The funny part is, 6 months earlier, I'd have done just about anything to get him to visit. My name is Ray Chalmers. I'm 68 years old. I live in a 2-story house in Orangeville, Ontario, about an hour northwest of Toronto, that I've owned since the early 90s. For most of my working life, I ran a small plumbing and heating company. Nothing that made the papers. 2 service vans, a handful of good guys, and enough work to keep us busy through the winters, which in this part of the province can be unforgiving. I started with used equipment and a landline phone on a folding table in my garage. By the time I sold the business, we had 9 employees and a reputation I was proud of. When I retired, I thought life would get quieter. It did, mostly. I started sleeping past 6. I took long drives with no particular destination. I learned that retirement isn't nothing. It's everything you kept putting off for 30 years finally arriving at your door at the same time. Most mornings I'd have breakfast at a diner in town called Hilda's on the main street near the library. Same corner table, same booth, same mug of coffee, dark roast, no sugar. The owner knew my order before I sat down. I drove the same Silverado I'd had for years. Rust along the wheel wells, heat that worked perfectly. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I never had been. My son, Stephen, is 41. He and his wife, Renata, live 40 minutes away in a newer subdivision near Brampton. Big house on a corner lot. 2 vehicles in the driveway, both leased. The kind of neighborhood where the garbage bins are all the same color and everyone power washes their driveway every spring, whether it needs it or not. When Stephen was young, we were close. The way a father and son can be when it's just the 2 of them figuring things out together. His mother, Carol, passed away from a stroke when he was 19. That year changed both of us. Stephen grew up fast, too fast, maybe. I buried myself in work, the way men sometimes do when the grief gets too heavy to carry directly. For a long time after that, Stephen and I leaned on each other without either of us quite saying so. He'd show up on Saturdays just to tinker in the garage with me. We didn't always talk. We didn't need to. Then he met Renata. I liked her well enough at first. She was sharp, organized, the kind of person who sends thank you cards and arrives early. But slowly, something in the dynamic between Stephen and me shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way I could point to and say, that's where it changed. Just gradually, the way a door settles in its frame until one day it doesn't quite close the way it used to. Phone calls got shorter. Visits happened less often. When I suggested coming for Sunday dinner, there was usually some reason it didn't work. I told myself it was normal. They had their own lives. 2 kids, a mortgage, busy schedules. I understood that. I'd lived that. But then the question started. How's the house holding up, Dad? You still comfortable managing everything on your own? Have you thought about what happens if something happens to you? They were gentle questions. Careful questions. The kind that sound like concern but land a little sideways. I noticed them. I didn't say anything. Not yet. One Sunday evening in February, Stephen called while I was watching the hockey game. After a few minutes of talking about nothing in particular, he said, "You still dealing with your finances yourself, Dad? Your RRSPs, the pension, all of that?" I laughed. "Who else would be dealing with them?" "No, just wondering. Just making sure you're comfortable with all of it." I said I was fine. We moved on. I didn't think much more about it that night. The call I didn't expect came on a Thursday morning in early spring. An old employee of mine named Gary phoned me out of the blue. Gary had worked with me for 16 years. Good plumber, terrible poker player, and one of those people who can't help knowing everyone's business. We talked about his new job for a while. Then he got quiet. "Listen, Ray," he said. "I don't know if I should be saying anything, but I heard something the other day that bothered me." "Go ahead." "I ran into Stephen at the Home Depot in Brampton. We got talking. He mentioned you'd been having some trouble with your memory, forgetting appointments, losing track of things." I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at my backyard. The bird feeder was swaying slightly in the wind. I hadn't forgotten a single appointment in my life. I had a calendar on the fridge, another on my phone, and a habit of writing everything down that Carol had instilled in me years ago. "He said that?" I asked. "Said he was worried about you, that he and Renata were trying to figure out what to do." After Gary hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time without moving. I wasn't angry, not right away. I was confused in that particular way that comes when someone you love says something that doesn't make sense to you, and you keep turning it over in your mind looking for the innocent explanation. I found one, then another, then a third. I talked myself out of all of them by nightfall. 2 weeks later, Stephen called again. He sounded warmer than usual, cheerful, almost. He asked about my health. He asked about the house. He asked whether I'd thought about maybe talking to someone about getting my affairs organized, legally speaking, just in case. He mentioned he knew a woman, a lawyer, who was very easy to work with, very straightforward. He said maybe the three of us could sit down together. Nothing formal. Just a conversation. I said I'd think about it. Something didn't sit right. It wasn't one thing. It was the combination of Gary's phone call, the questions about the house, the sudden warmth after months of distance. I sat with that feeling for a few days. Then I called Paulette. Paulette Gagnon and I had worked together for nearly 15 years when I ran the business. She'd handled all the books, the taxes, the service contracts, the insurance renewals, every piece of paper that needed to be properly understood and properly filed. She was the most organized person I'd ever met, and the most quietly perceptive. She'd retired a couple of years before me and moved to a property near Collingwood, where she kept a garden and a very opinionated cat. We stayed in touch the way people do when they've worked through enough stressful seasons together, that friendship becomes the natural result. I didn't call Paulette because I thought my son was guilty of something. I called her because I trusted her judgment more than I trusted my own in that moment, and because I needed someone who could look at everything without the fog of being a father getting in the way. The conversation went on for nearly 2 hours. I told her everything. The questions, Gary's call, the sudden warmth, the mention of the lawyer. Paulette listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to come up?" she asked. "I'd appreciate it." She arrived 10 days later with a suitcase and a folder of questions she'd already prepared. She stayed in the guest room, and we worked through everything at the kitchen table the same way we'd worked through tax season for 15 years. Methodically. Without drama. The first thing she did was ask me to pull together everything. Pension statements, the deed to the house, the investment accounts, my TFSA, my will, the whole picture. The second thing she did was ask me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Who had I mentioned things to, and when? Had anyone asked about my power of attorney? Had anyone suggested I consider adding someone to any of my accounts? I answered yes to the last one. Renata had mentioned it once, casually, the previous fall. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. Paulette wrote it down and said nothing. Then, by accident, something else surfaced. An old acquaintance of mine who runs a real estate office in town mentioned he'd had an inquiry about property values in my neighborhood. Someone asking about typical sale timelines for properties on my street and what a house in my condition might list for. He thought it was a potential buyer doing research and hadn't thought twice about it. The inquiry had come from Renata's email address. I remember the moment Paulette slid that across the table. I didn't say anything for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a chickadee landed on the feeder and flew off again. "Maybe it's nothing," I said. Paulette looked at me the way she used to look at a contractor's invoice that didn't add up. "Maybe," she said. But we both knew it wasn't nothing. I didn't sleep well that week. I'd lie in bed and go over every conversation I'd had with Stephen in the past year, picking through them the way you pick through an attic box you've avoided for years, not sure what you're going to find. I kept coming back to the same thing. There had been a shift, a slow, deliberate shift toward control, questions about my finances, a rumor about my memory. Now someone quietly inquiring about my house. One evening I got up around 2 in the morning because I couldn't lie still. I stood in the kitchen making tea I didn't particularly want, looking at a photo of Stephen and me that Carol had taken at a Canada Day picnic in 1997. He was 9 years old, wearing a hat too big for his head, holding a sparkler with both hands. He looked so proud of himself. I'd kept that photo on the fridge for 20 years without really thinking about it. That night, I looked at it for a long time. I almost talked myself out of everything right there. I almost decided to let it go, sign whatever was put in front of me, keep the peace, not make it into something. That is the honest truth of it. Because that's what fathers do, sometimes. They tell themselves they're being reasonable, when really they're just afraid of losing the relationship they have with their child, even when that relationship has already started becoming something else. I didn't let it go. But it wasn't easy. A few days later, Paulette sat down across from me with a folder and said, "Ray, I need you to look at something." She opened it and put a document on the table. It was a printout of an online inquiry, not anything illegal. Nothing private. Just a question that had been submitted through the website of a financial services company, asking in quite specific terms about the process for obtaining legal authority over an aging parent's registered accounts when the parent was deemed to have reduced decision-making capacity. It had been submitted using contact information that traced back to Stephen's household. I stared at the page for a long time. Paulette didn't push. She knew when to wait. "He thinks I can't manage my own money," I finally said. Paulette's voice was careful. "Someone in that house thinks you're a problem that needs to be managed." That sentence did something to me that I wasn't prepared for. Not rage, exactly. Something slower and sadder than rage. The feeling of realizing that someone who grew up in your house, who you drove to hockey practice every winter Saturday morning, who cried at his mother's funeral with his head against your arm, had somewhere along the way stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a situation to be handled. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called a lawyer of my own. Her name was Brenda Lau, a partner at a firm in Orangeville, and she'd been recommended to me by someone I trusted. I met with her twice over the following 2 weeks. I told her everything. She reviewed my existing documents, asked questions I hadn't considered, and walked me through my options clearly and without rushing. Afterwards, she said something that I wrote down on the notepad I keep by my desk. "Your assets are yours. Your decisions are yours. Anyone who tries to change that without your full informed consent is stepping well outside their rights." I appreciated the clarity. Over the next several weeks, Paulette and I worked through everything. We updated my will. I established a trust with proper safeguards. I had a frank conversation with Brenda about my power of attorney, who held it, and what the limits of that authority actually were. I made decisions I should have made sooner, not because anyone had forced my hand, but because having someone try to move the pieces around you has a way of reminding you that the pieces are yours to move. I also changed a few other things, but I kept those to myself. When Stephen finally called to set up the meeting with his lawyer, I agreed. I set a time for a Wednesday afternoon. He said they'd come over around 3. I called Paulette. The afternoon arrived clear and cold, the kind of late October day in Ontario when the leaves are mostly down and the sky has that particular flat gray quality that's not quite threatening but isn't quite reassuring either. I had the kettle on. The table was clear. Paulette arrived at 1:30. When the knock came at the front door, I answered it myself. Stephen came in first. His wife was just behind him. Between them, they were carrying a leather satchel, and the particular body language of people who believe they're about to complete a transaction they've been planning for some time. Then Stephen saw Paulette. The change in his face happened quickly, the way weather moves across a field. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't even considered her. Renata's eyes went immediately to the folder on the table, then back to Paulette, then to me. "Dad," Stephen said, his voice dropping to something quieter. "When did you call her?" I looked at Paulette, who was watching my son with the serene expression of a woman who has dealt with bad accounting for 30 years and doesn't panic easily. "Afternoon, Stephen," she said. He introduced the woman they'd brought as Lindsay, a lawyer from a firm in Mississauga. She shook hands all around and looked as though she was privately recalibrating the situation. We sat. We exchanged brief pleasantries. Then I told them I wouldn't be signing anything that day. I was still reviewing documents with my own legal counsel and wasn't in a position to make any decisions until that process was complete. Stephen's jaw tightened. Renata's expression went very still. "Dad, this is just standard planning. I understand what it is," I said. "I'm taking my time with it." The meeting lasted about 25 minutes. When they left, Paulette and I sat at the kitchen table and drank our tea and didn't say anything for a while. "Well," she said eventually, "that was about what I expected. The hardest part wasn't the lawyer. It wasn't the paperwork. It was seeing the look on my son's face when he realized I wasn't alone in that room. He hadn't looked worried. He'd looked caught. Those are different things." For the weeks that followed, I kept moving forward with what Brenda and I had put in place. My son called once, 3 days after the meeting. He said he was just checking in. We talked about nothing consequential and hung up politely. Renata didn't call. I thought about Stephen a lot during that time. Not with anger exactly, with something more like grief. Because this wasn't a stranger who tried to take something from me. This was my son. The boy who used to fall asleep on the couch on Saturday nights while we watched the late game, who I'd carried to bed more times than I could count. The young man who had stood beside me at his mother's grave in November 22 years ago and held my arm because I wasn't sure I was going to stay upright. I didn't know exactly when the shift had happened. I suspected it had started with money, specifically with the pressure of the kind of lifestyle that always needs more than it has. The house in Brampton wasn't cheap. The vehicles weren't cheap. The private preschool for the grandkids that they'd mentioned once and then never mentioned again. That wasn't cheap either. I'm not saying that excused anything. I'm saying I understood the context, even if I couldn't excuse the choices made inside it. In early December, I hosted the annual Christmas gathering I'd been hosting since Carol was alive. Friends, neighbors, a few people from the old business. Every year, same Saturday, same house, same pot of her mulled cider recipe that I'd had to reconstruct from memory after she passed. People expected it. Nobody questioned the invitation. Stephen and Renata came. I'd asked them, and they'd accepted, which told me something about where we were. Paulette came too. The evening started well. People ate, they talked. The house felt the way it's supposed to feel in December when you've lived in it long enough. My neighbor from 2 doors down spent 15 minutes explaining his opinion on the best way to insulate a garage in central Ontario. He'd told me this 3 times before. I let him tell me again. By 9 o'clock, most people had moved to the living room. I was standing near the fireplace when I felt the energy shift. Stephen and Renata were near the far window. I'd noticed them having a quiet, close conversation that stopped when Paulette walked past. I waited until most people had their drinks, and the noise had settled to a comfortable hum. Then I tapped my glass with a spoon. Not loudly, just enough. People turned. Conversations faded. I looked around the room. Friends of 30 years. People who'd known Carol. People who'd watched Stephen grow up in this house. "I want to say something while I have everyone together," I said. "And I want to say it plainly, because that's how I've always tried to operate." A few people smiled. Stephen's face had gone very still. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point at anyone. I talked about the past year. The questions about my memory that had been circulating without my knowledge. The inquiry about my house that had been made without my knowledge. The documents I'd been asked to sign that, on careful legal review, would have transferred very broad decision-making authority over my finances to a third party, under conditions I had not agreed to. I didn't use anyone's name. I didn't have to. The room was quiet in a way a room gets quiet when everyone understands what they're hearing, but is still processing whether it's real. Renata spoke first. Ray, I really think you're mischaracterizing. I'm describing what the documents said, I said. My lawyer reviewed them. Paulette reviewed them. I'm confident in the characterization. Stephen had gone slightly pale. He stood up from his chair. Dad, this isn't the place? You made your plans without involving me, I said. I'm involving everyone else. I think that's fair. Silence. Then Stephen said the thing he should not have said. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe the pressure of the room got to him. Maybe he'd been carrying it too long to hold it in. He looked at Renata and said, So what? We just forget about everything we planned. The whole. He stopped himself. Too late. You could hear the change in the room. Someone, near the hallway, set down their glass very carefully. My neighbor, who had stopped talking about garage insulation, looked at the floor. Stephen's face told me he knew exactly what he'd done. I waited a few seconds. I didn't want to be cruel. I just wanted to be clear. I've made a few decisions this year, I said. The house is one of them. I listed it in September. I closed last month. I'm moving to a 2-bedroom condo in Collingwood in January, near the water. Stephen stared at me. My finances have been restructured into a trust with proper legal oversight. Paulette is involved as an advisor. My power of attorney is held by someone I trust completely, with clear, limited parameters. Renata was very still. And the remainder of my estate, when the time comes, will go to a trades apprenticeship fund through the local college, for young people who want to build something with their hands and need a fair start to do it. Nobody spoke. Somewhere in the kitchen, the kettle that I'd forgotten about clicked off. Outside, a car went slowly past the house. That was all. Stephen looked at me for a long moment. His expression went through several things I recognized. Shock, calculation, something that might have been shame. Renata touched his arm. He didn't move. Dad, he finally said, why would you do that? I thought about Carol, about the way she used to say that the problem with pride was that it cost more than it was worth. About the 22 years I'd spent keeping this family together after she was gone. About the Saturday mornings in the garage and the hockey rinks and the graduation and the wedding where I'd danced badly and been happy about it. Because I built something, I said, and I get to decide what becomes of it. He shook his head. Renata picked up her coat from the arm of the chair. I watched my son cross the living room, past people who had known him since he was a boy, and walk out through the front door into the December night. Renata followed without making eye contact with anyone. A car started in the driveway. The room stayed quiet for another moment. Then gently, conversations resumed. Paulette came to stand beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I slept better that night than I had in months. The morning after, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table in the early light and waited for the guilt to arrive. It came, but it was different than I expected. Quieter, less like a verdict and more like an echo. I missed my son. I hadn't stopped loving him. Those two things and everything that had happened could all be true at the same time, and for a while I just let them be. In January, I moved to the condo. Smaller, simpler, a third-floor unit with a view of the bay that changes every hour depending on the sky. I unpacked in a day and a half. For the first time in many years, everything in my home was exactly where I put it, and meant exactly what I wanted it to mean. Stephen didn't call in December. He didn't call in January. The grandkids' Christmas concert came and went, and I found out about it through a photo someone else posted. That hurt, if I'm being honest. More than the rest of it, actually. Not being asked to come to that concert. I sat with that for a while. I started a new routine in Collingwood. Coffee in the morning, at a place near the water, with mismatched chairs and a wall of local photographs. A walk along the waterfront trail, most afternoons when the weather allowed. Twice a week, I drove to a local college to help with their Trades Foundation program, sitting with students who were learning electrical and plumbing basics, answering questions, listening to them talk about why they'd chosen this over the other paths available to them. One of them, a young woman from Barrie named Shayla, reminded me of myself at 20. Not in her circumstances, Hers had been harder, but in the specific way she paid attention to things. The quiet concentration of someone who actually wants to understand how something works. I thought about that more than I thought about the inheritance. March arrived and the ice on the bay started pulling back from the shore. I was on the waterfront trail on a Thursday morning when my phone rang. It was Stephen. I stopped walking, stood there with the wind off the water and a family of geese passing loudly overhead. Looked at his name on the screen for a moment. "Hello," I said. A pause. "Dad." His voice was different. Not smaller, exactly. Something else. Strained, maybe. Like something had been pushing against it for a long time. We talked around the edges of things for a few minutes. He asked about the condo. I told him about the view. He said the kids had been asking about me. That part cost me something, hearing it. I kept my voice steady. Then he stopped circling. "I handled this badly," he said. "Yes," I said. "You did." Silence. Renata and I have been having a lot of hard conversations. I didn't try to make it easier for him. I just listened. I think I convinced myself I was being practical, that I was looking out for you. But I wasn't. He stopped. I was scared of what would happen when. He didn't finish the sentence. "When I'm gone," I said. "Yeah, that fear's understandable, Stephen. What happened after it isn't?" He didn't argue. That surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't have. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. Not about money, not about the trust or the house or the condo. About his mother, a little. About what I'd been like in the years after she died. About things he'd carried that I hadn't known he was carrying. The conversation went places I hadn't expected it to go, and I was glad it did. Before we hung up, he said, "Do you think we can get there?" I thought about what there meant. Not back to where we'd been, maybe. That particular road had changed behind us. But forward, towards something different. Something built a little more honestly. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm not done trying." He went quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry, Dad, I mean that." 3 words, no conditions on them, just the words. After we hung up, I stood at the water's edge for a long time. The bay was still half frozen, the ice breaking up in irregular gray and white pieces near the shore. I watched it for a while. Then I started walking again, because that's what you do. You put one foot forward, and then another, and eventually you're somewhere new. Not because the path was straight, but because you kept going anyway. I won't pretend I know how this ends. Maybe Stephen and I rebuild something. Maybe we build something different. Maybe some distance remains, and we learn to live in it with some degree of grace. Families are complicated. My wife used to say that all the time, usually with a small smile that meant she'd made her peace with it. She was right. She usually was. What I know is this. I'm 68 years old. I built a business from the ground up. I buried my wife. I raised a son. I built a life that was quiet in the right ways and full in the right ways. And when someone, even someone I loved, tried to decide that my life had become a problem to be managed, I decided otherwise. That's not revenge. It's not a victory. It's just a man standing in his own life and insisting it's still his. If you're in a similar position, and I think more of you are than would ever say so out loud, I want you to know something. You're allowed to protect yourself and still love the person you're protecting yourself from. Those two things don't cancel each other out. Sometimes they have to exist in the same space until one of them can slowly become unnecessary. That takes time. It takes patience. And it takes deciding, somewhere along the way, that your dignity is not something you owe to anyone, not even your own children.